You are listening to the global network of podcasters dedicated to the pharmacy profession. Welcome to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
This is the PainPod.
You want to see pain? Look at these.
Welcome to the PainPod, the podcast for all things pain management. Hosted by the Pain Guy, Dr. Mark Garofoli. We'll be collaborating with numerous pain management experts, talking about substance usage disorders, the latest treatment modalities, and most important, focusing on the pain of our patients as leading providers of pain care. And now, here's our host, a man wanted in all 50 states, a suburban city-like mountain man,
Without the beard.
from the hills of West Virginia, and certified in weapons of mass destruction response. It's Dr. Mark Garofoli.
All right, welcome back everyone to the PainPod. So here today, well, we're going to do a little follow-up, an encore, if you will. So our most previous episode was on topical pain medications. Well, we didn't really devote a lot of time to the prescription side of things. Talked about the big picture, of course, but didn't do a warranted amount of effort there on the prescription products, the FDA-approved products, when it comes to topical pain medications. So this is the Encore. This is topical pain medications part 2 here on the PainPod. So big picture, of course, we got to remember that, here in America, well, we don't utilize a lot of topical medications in general, but certainly topical pain medications to the same degree that, well, everybody on the rest of the planet does, right? But hey, then again, comes to pain medicines, we're used to being different. First up, there's the metric system, and then, well, what we do. And, specifically, of course, there's also paracetamol. The whole world calls it paracetamol. We call it acetaminophen and various other things, right? So, different strokes, different folks. We're all different. And, we got to keep that in mind overall of, opening up our minds, removing any blinders, for the utilization of topical pain medications overall. Now, on the last episode, we touched on the big picture, topical compared to transdermal, the inherent differences, of course, for topical to the target, transdermal effects elsewhere as well, right? And then we broke down things into the counter irritants, those that are warming and cooling in their effects for topical pain medications. Then, of course, we had the numbing options, the anti-inflammation options, and then a couple other options as well, too, right? But let's hone in on, when thinking about the bigger groups like counter irritants, numbing agents, inflammation agents, and then the rest of the crew. Let's jump back to those counter irritants, that idea right there, for our conversation today, involving the prescription side. So let's take that journey, right? So again, with counter irritants, we're thinking causing hot, causing cold. There is a difference, of course, heat, resulting in vasodilation, cold, vasoconstriction. There's differences there, of course. But, what we want to hone in here on is probably within the warming agents, are capsaicinoids, or a little bit easier to say, capsaicin, right? And if you remember how it works, it's a TRPV1 agonist. We went over that in the previous episode, but in a nutshell, a TRPV1 agonist was found to be, the mechanism, how the thing's working in the background for, within the human body. In fact, of course, just a reminder that there was actually a 2021 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for discovering the two scientists that discovered that, the way that our bodies sense and perceive and process is probably the best word. Hot and cold would be TRPV1 for hot, TRPV1 hot, and then TRPM8 or TRPM8 for processing cold sensations, right? Well, if it's good enough for a Nobel Prize, good enough for discussing on the PainPod, maybe even twice, right? But TRPV1, we're going to hone in on that. That's the hot side, right? Coming in hot. Boom. Transient receptor potential cation channel subfamily V, right? Member 1, or we could say TRPV1, right? So overall functions, detecting and even regulating heat as well, works within inflammation along the way as well too. Now, we previously talked about the OTC options for capsaicin, the poster children for the little finger cots to not get that stuff in your eye, right? But on the prescription side, there we've got, we want to dive into that realm overall. So there's a much higher octane patch. Kind of struggle on calling it a patch. Most people will say a patch, right? But in all reality, it's like a delivery system. And that would be the 8% capsaicin delivery system, right? A lot of people say patch. Brand name wise, we're talking Qutenza. That's got 2 different FDA approvals. One for post-herpetic neuralgia, so PHN, and then one for diabetic peripheral neuropathy, or DPN. Now, there's differences abound when it comes to the 2 different approvals for that particular formulation. The overall idea is that the application is done, in a office, right? In say like a clinic or AmCare or, whatever we're thinking there. This isn't, hey, pick the prescription up at the pharmacy and go home. This is involving a healthcare professional, right? In fact, for post-herpetic neuralgia, you're looking at a 1-hour application. Now, that's not 1 hour of work. That's 1 hour of a patient, laying back and having that delivery device, kind of like a tape, perhaps, if you will, but a lot of people refer to it as a patch, overall being applied for 60 minutes. Okay. A little bit of prep before that as well, too, and afterwards. Usually do that every 3 months. Now, for the other indication for diabetic peripheral neuropathy, there you're looking at a half an hour. So it cuts the time in half. But then again, you're talking feet typically, for DPN, and the larger area for PHN overall. So, you got to think about the patient experience throughout that, just kind of chilling, pun kind of intended, sitting back and having that applied for either half an hour or an hour, depending on the condition that the patient has along the way. A couple unique things, in general, sometimes, in the studies anyway, it was found that some people won't respond to the treatment initially. In fact, it might take a good number of times of applications to get the response, but in the end, hey, it's all about, improving function and reducing pain overall. The buy one, get one in the big picture. So some big picture things to keep in mind overall. But there, of course, we're talking about diabetic peripheral neuropathy. A couple things I want to mention there. So, symptoms, of course, typically it's the feet and legs, for first offenders or first noticing. You're going to have that typical neuropathy descriptions with a patient, burning, stabbing, tingling, lightning, numbness, all that, right? You know how you could actually feel that? So check this out. I have to admit, I actually endeavored into this. If somebody has never experienced neuropathy, and would like to know what our patients in pain with neuropathy are feeling, check with your healthcare provider before doing anything like this, or just take my word for it. But if you go into a hot tub and then immediately go into one of those super cold tubs, odds are you're going to feel neuropathy pretty instantaneously and pretty profoundly. Been there, done that. There wasn't a t-shirt. Please just take my word for it. That is a way for the common person to kind of be there and understand what a patient's going through. Okay. All right. So generally with DPN, symptoms are going to be worse at night. There's going to be a little bit less feeling to changes in temperature, not necessarily the weather report, but just, in the inherent area. And certainly touch is going to be a thing, more sensitivity overall. As far as diagnosis for DPN, first thing you want to do is rule out other things like, hey, is there, any vitamin B12 deficiencies or concerns? That's a big one, folks. You think about it. The name is diabetic peripheral neuropathy, right? So patient with diabetes, what's one of the most common medications? I know these days we're thinking of, maybe an injectable or two, but regardless of what country you're in, but metformin, right? Comes to mind. What's one of those side effects we got to watch for? Well, it affects the absorption for, vitamin B12. So there could be some deficiencies. So it's like, hey, chicken or egg here for where DPN's coming from. Just ruling out other causes. That's one of many, of course, too. So now nerve function tests are actually the lay of the land. Things like filament tests, EMG or nerve conduction velocity tests, just to name a hot 3 there. But nerve function tests, that's really the lay of the land overall, once ruling out other ideas. Now, in 2022, there were new treatment guidelines that were, proposed, basically from AAN. I have all of these certainly within our show notes and all that. But like every guideline pertaining to pain management, you could readily access these here on painguide.us, my website, of course. If you go to the resources tab on painguide.us, you can access pretty much any pain management guideline you're going to want to look for. And if I'm missing something, folks, let me know. The little chat bot will come up, message me, comes to me, call it a day, right? I digress. So for DPN, there's multiple recommendations, of course, within those guidelines. The fifth one, actually break it up to two separate parts, but basically they're emphasizing that, hey, clinicians should assess for patient preferences for, formulations, one of them being topical. And if the patient prefers something like a topical or whatever else, consider that route, right? They actually say, hey, if you're considering topical for DPN, then consider capsaicin, amongst a couple other things, right? So that's where we're in the realm here overall. Now, if you're diving further into the this particular product for DPN or PHN, the capsaicin 8%. There's, the studies are out there. You could certainly look them up. We can include them as well, too, for show notes. But the general idea is that, hey, there's FDA approval, so there's proven safety and efficacy, right? Pretty obvious there. One of the bigger picture questions, though, is what that application, right? So typically, you're having what you could call patches, but it's really like large films, picture like old school, not looking at digital x-rays, but, looking at the actual films, right? But you could be cutting those in certain ways to be able to wrap them around the foot. You're going to have a clinician doing that, the actual application where, oftentimes first have a local anesthetic applied, then, cut to the size of what's needed, certainly utilizing nitrile gloves, of note, not latex, and then have that application on there for a half an hour for DPN for patients. Afterwards, taking that film or patch, if you want to call it that, off, you're rolling it inward. That basically makes it so that you're not getting any of the ingredient anywhere. And then there's a cleansing gel, and wipe it up, and we call it a day along the way there. Still got to tell the patient, hey, watch out for any hot showers or hot liquids in general, any irritation like that, sun, avoiding sunburn, of course, exercise, things like that. Just for the next few days overall. I did mention that product's actually also approved for post-herpetic neuralgia. Whew, that's a tough one, right? You think about those times of when do you want to explain pain? Well, post-herpetic neuralgia, as far as neuropathy goes, whoo doggy, right? Burning, shaking, electric shock-like pain. You got that sensitivity to touch. You got itching, numbness, you name it. Like the perfect opportunity to cover things like allodynia, hyperalgesia, dysesthesia. It's usually pain that's at least 3 months after a shingles rash heals, hence post-herpetic neuralgia, right? The pain's typically where the shingles occurred. And, the remarkable part would be, hey, there's that type of pain, and you had shingles about 3 months ago, right? Now, as far as treatment, we have our options. Again, these types of guidelines available on painguide.us as well. But you got, oral, you're typically looking at things like TCAs or gabapentinoids, injectables or glucocorticoid option with methylprednisolone. Topical wise, though, hey, that's what we're here for, right? Topical pain medications. So there we're typically looking at things like lidocaine patches. We talked about the numbing agents previously. Topical capsaicin, as we mentioned, aspirin cream, TCA cream like doxepin as well too. So now, one thing when mentioning PHN, post-herpetic neuralgia, an ounce of prevention is worth, well, a lot of treatment, right? So there we're always wanting to talk with patients and the public, everybody about, the recombinant zoster vaccine or RZV, Shingrix, for preventing it in the first place, right? All right, so that was a decent amount there on capsaicin topically in a prescription form. We also casually about 30 seconds ago started talking about, well, what about lidocaine? So let's bring that up again, because we have some options when it comes to the prescription side. Again, lidocaine, as a reminder, it's working on those old sodium potassium pumps that we all were subjected to probably week 2 of freshman year in biology, right? We all had to learn our sodium potassium pumps. Why? Well, probably for this podcast, right? Now everybody has a seat at the table. Anyways, when it comes to transdermal lidocaine, just want to mention it. It's not topical. We're here for topicals, but it's worth a mention. There's a couple nuances here as well too. Like for instance, for our transdermal lidocaine options, prescription side, there's Dermalid. There, one of the recommendations for patients is to avoid water. There's Lidoderm, available as generics, of course. Also want to avoid water. There's ZT Lido, relatively higher cost, but that's going to depend on formulary coverage, all that great stuff. But you avoid the need to avoid water, which is kind of cool, right? Pun intended again. That's one of the, just making things more easier to incorporate into people's lives. But again, we have our balance of what's available as far as products and all that. All of them, though, it's 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Incredibly important to go over a patient, right? That's really important in the big picture. All right, so let's see. Talked about the not necessarily needing to avoid liquid/water. The whole exercise concerns, showering, bathing concerns with ZT Lido for that transdermal lidocaine. That it uses a different technology in the formulation, right? Basically, and it's known as the 1.8%. That's relatively equivalent based on multiple references to about 5% of the lidocaine patch, because both are going to aim to deliver 15 milligrams of lidocaine, just to be specific, but it's all in the formulations, right? But again, the big picture is, there's no head-to-head studies for all these things, but, the whole exercise, bathing, all that kind of stuff, right? All right, so that's our numbing agents. Let's jump ship and go over to the inflammation topical, typically prescription pain medication options, right? It's all about diclofenac then, right? So on the prescription side, we have topical diclofenac patches. We got multiple. Topical diclofenac solution, we got one there basically. And then topical diclofenac gel, which is also available over the counter now, right? We touched on that one in the previous episode if you want to tag them up together here. But let's, jump a little bit into these prescription versions of topical diclofenac for inflammation. So first up with the patches, we, of course, one of the first ones here is basically Flector. And that is, certainly approved for acute care. The dosing is twice daily. That's pretty much the important thing there to remember with, that particular formulation, the generic Flector patch, diclofenac, that is, being twice daily. Because then there's also, ironically from the same company, I believe, at least originally, is the Leichhardt patch, which is once daily, right? Also just approved for acute care overall. But the overall idea there is that, again, going closer to that, making it easier to incorporate into one's life. Some people might prefer to have a more hands-on approach, with more often throughout the day. Others are leading busy lives. Once a day can be a big difference compared to twice a day, right? All right. Now, I also mentioned the topical diclofenac solution, or PainPod, available generic, of course, as well. That's your 2% solution. The actual, not necessarily formulation, but the delivery container has changed throughout the years and decades, really. But now it's a 3.8 ounce bottle. Got to watch that for TSA and traveling, right? Because it's over 3 ounces. Yeah, in the PainPod, we get nitty and gritty with what we can help patients with, right? Got to think about these things, right? Of course, that formulation has that DMSO penetration enhancer in it, dimethyl sulfoxide. And yes, if you listen to the previous episode of the PainPod, you will certainly remember that has a low likelihood, but a possibility of a side effect of garlic breath, even though it's applied topically, right? Good golly. It's 1% of patients, but still, it's because of that DMSO and how it's basically, I guess we'll say, metabolized or changed within the body to end up with some water and dimethyl sulfide, which you guessed it smells like garlic, right? So yeah, it's not just an Italian thing. It has nothing to do with my family vineyard over in the back of the boot in Italy. It's actually a topical NSAID, right? All right. Now, on the previous episode, we talked about the OTC Voltaren gel. Same idea here for the prescription version, of course. It's been approved prescription-wise for almost 20 years, but there are some little tags with it, pearls, if you will, that it's 2 to 4 grams 4 times daily for a patient, and it may take a week to see efficacy. So there's nuances there along the way as well too. It's really intended for osteoarthritis joint pain, thinking hands, knees, and feet. Not for other stuff like strains, sprains, bruises, sports injuries, you name it, right? All right, big picture, as far as dosing, if you're talking up top, like, hands, like I mentioned there previously, you're thinking 2 grams, but down below for knees and feet, you're thinking 4 grams. And there's usually a dosing card that will help a patient visually see how much to squeeze out of the tube, right? Typically less ends up in what is intended when you're talking about topical agents overall. All right, so let's, one other one I mentioned here too was topical doxepin. It's the Zonulon cream. It's a prescription, of course. So they're, localized tricyclic antidepressant, TCA. It's approved, 4 times a day for itching. But hey, what about neuropathic pain as well too, right? So that's something we want to put in there. We saw that in the guideline when we were talking earlier. Overall, again, with those guidelines readily available on painguide.us, but that came up when we were talking about post-herpetic neuralgia as far as the guideline there. Just recommendations in general too. So that's the core, the really the key core ingredients, formulations, products when we're talking prescription topical pain medications. As we break them down to counter irritants, the hot and the cold, numbing, inflammation, and then Doc's been kind of hanging out in his own island. But wait, there's so much more too, right? When you think about it, like there's, of course, there's compounded medications, pharmacies that are compounding topical options. Common ingredients there, I'll run through a laundry list. Things like ketamine, ketoprofen, baclofen, benzocaine, cyclobenzaprine, clonidine, gabapentin. Take any and every combination of those, right? There's specific things like gabapentin, clonidine in pluronic lecithin organogel, if I said that correctly. PLO, let's go with that. There's the triple anesthetic, benzocaine, lidocaine, tetracaine, BLT. No bacon included, right? What other things have we seen? Ketamine, ketoprofen, gabapentin. There was Bacplo. So you got that, PLO again, but with baclofen, amitriptyline, ketamine. I've seen Apno, typically with ibuprofen. So that's the all-purpose nipple ointment, betamethasone valerate, mupirosone, miconazole, and then that plus ibuprofen along the way. There's many, many more, of course, as far as the compounds. Then we also have less known prescription topical agents that are, FDA approved, readily available, where these things don't actually even have to be compounded overall. So we certainly want to keep that in mind as well too. There's things like ketoprofen topical cream, gabapentin topical cream. They're already made. They're readily available. So you can certainly check that out, as well in the big picture too. All right, so that was a lot of the, the core prescription products, the compounded and the lesser known prescription products. But wait, there's more. What more could there be, you ask? Well, we didn't cover a little bit more on that CBD topical formulation, right? Yeah, encore of an encore. So let's cover topical CBD. On the tip of everyone's tongue, and a question that's quite frankly observed to be very frequently asked within our society, right? So let's go to the basics. So when we're talking cannabis, cannabinoids, or even CBD specifically, you got typically mechanisms of action, including CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors. CB1, think of the digit 1. It is tall. It is narrow. Kind of like the CNS. So those receptors are primarily in the CNS. The digit, the number 2, is a little bit wider. So remember that as being, they're out typically in the periphery, like immune system and GI tract. Hopefully that helps. But how do these things work? Like CBD, we're going to talk about CBD, right? So THC is a partial agonist at both CB1 and CB2. CBD, not so much. CBD is an antagonist at CB1, the opposite of THC. It's also, get this one, a negative allosteric modulator at CB2. So kind of like the opposite of THC. But what the heck is a negative allosteric modulator? Well, love covering that one. What I call it is a backseat driver. Yep, you heard it here first. Negative allosteric modulator, it talks about something interacting with the receptor where it doesn't bind at the actual receptor. It binds next door, but it will affect the outcome. And that's why I call it a backseat driver. They're not driving. They're back there. They'll have comments. They can affect the outcome, right? Shout out to all of our backseat drivers, right? Good golly. All right, what else do we need to know about CBD? So as far as, helping patients with selection, eventually we're talking topical here, but, there's full spectrum, broad spectrum, and isolate. Full spectrum simply includes all cannabinoids, including THC. Broad spectrum, all the cannabinoids except THC, as per labeling. And of course, the isolate for a CBD product is isolated. It's just CBD, as per the label. We do have our concerns with labeling still these days. The most recent dynamic study was from 2022 that showed that a good amount of the market is hitting the target for accuracy and labeling for CBD content. But it's roughly about half the market, according to that study. So imagine being the company that does the due diligence and makes a accurate labeled product, but everybody else in the market isn't doing that, so you get a bad rep. Or vice versa is concerning in the opposite direction, right? So things we got to keep in mind overall. Turns out for patients, customers, consumers, Consumer Reports actually has a shopping guide for CBD. I'll keep that in the show notes for us too. But what are some things, one or two other things here, just for our patients, right? And for ourselves to know. You always want to be looking at the certificate of analysis. It's like the rundown of the report of what's in this thing, right? Certainly want to make sure they're comprehensive. They typically test for a lot of things. I want to make sure that it's completed by, a third-party lab, not the company themselves. Make sure they're lot specific and record on repeat, not just ones from 5 years ago, and that they're readily available. Typically a QR code these days, right? So that leads us to the whole, topical cannabinoid or topical CBD specifically products. Typically got creams, gels, ointments, just like the rest of the gang. Human skin absorption rate is pretty low. CBD is said to be a little bit more than THC, but tomato, like anything, we kind of got to check ourselves on this when we say, oh, these topicals have very low absorption. Isn't that the point sometimes? You don't want as much systemic absorption. You don't want it throughout the whole body to get all the rest of the baggage. We call them side effects, right? That being said, things we've heard of for getting around the low absorption, certainly higher concentrations could potentially help with that. Applying generously, going all Baywatch from back in the 90s, I guess, for applying generously, may be able to. But that's the big picture overall. We got to have SMART goals. They got to be measurable and attainable for what we're looking for from our topical agents. We don't want to set the bar too high for our patients. Quite frankly, whether prescription or over the counter or whatever, we want to be reasonable in our goals overall, typically complementary to other pain management treatment options in the overall toolbox, right? Now, nothing new here. Of course, these topical CBD products have been in pharmacies for years now, and they're everywhere else as well now too, right? So that's why I just want to add that on here where it's not really prescription, but kind of sort of something maybe, right? But, to have 2 episodes talking about topical pain medicines and not touch on CBD products for more than 12 seconds, that would be a loss, right? So wanted to do that here for us today on the PainPod. All right, we want to keep things as succinct as possible. So we went over the nuts and bolts of the primary prescription topical pain medicines, added in a couple compounds and a couple readily available things as well overall to make life a little bit easier for clinicians and patients alike. And then also added in a little touch of CBD on there topically as well, right? So I hope this perhaps intertwined and kind of added on to the first topical pain medicine episode here on the PainPod serve you well, whether clinician, whether patient, whether lay person, whoever, and everyone, right? But I thank you, of course, for your time and for tuning into the PainPod once again. And as always, I wish you a great day every day.
If you'd like to join Mark on the PainPod, send us an email to publisher at pharmacypodcast.com. And make sure to share the show and subscribe on your favorite podcast directory. Thanks for listening.